Okay, folks. Now, firstly, I'd like to thank James and the ONeill Country Historical Society for the kind invitation to speak here tonight. And then, if I may, perhaps explain why you find someone raised in Belfast speaking on this subject. Foremostly, I've lived in Castlecaulfield, or Ballydonnelly as it was anciently known, for nearly 30 years. And as an historian, I think it's essential that I try and learn something about the place where I live. But perhaps more curiously, I was intrigued by the seeming lack of study into Clan O'Donnelly, who were blood relations, hereditary marshals and fosterers of the O'Neills. I want to first look at the origins of O'Donnelly. Before I look at the origins of O'Donnelly and their history, I want to look briefly at some name distributions regarding the name. So just bear with me a minute. So this slide examines the occurrences of the name Donnelly within the 1901 Census of Ireland. And you can immediately see the proliferation of the name in Ulster. Tyrone tops the chart, followed by the main metropolitan centres of Dublin and Belfast, County Antrim, which have likely resulted from the Industrial Revolution and the migration of rural families to urban areas to find work. The other area of note is County Armagh, which I will look at in a little more detail shortly. The table here is again drawn from the 1901 Census of Ireland, but here we compare the occurrences of the name Donnelly with the names of the other families known to have an historical connection to the O'Neills. It's interesting to note the position of the Donnellys as the second largest of the families in Tyrone and third largest for Ireland as a whole. That's just within that Kinaloan group, if you like. In this slide, I've focused on occurrences of the name O'Donnelly in County Armagh from the Hearth Money Roll of 1664. And in particular, you'll note the 8 households recorded in the parish of Eoghain, next to Benburb. That's from about the 3rd row down to about the 10th row there. So Townlands, Lesadian, Drumduff, Edenderry, Achantara and Tullymore. So that's from the 1664 Hearth Money Roll. All of this statistical data suggests that despite the privations of war and conflict in the 16th and 17th centuries, Clan O'Donnelly has managed to survive and indeed flourish. But perhaps more remarkably remain within the geographical area with which the family has had ties dating back several hundred years. Is this merely an accident or the outworking of deliberate attempts by the family to survive the upheavals of the 9 Years' War, the Ulster Plantation and the Irish Rebellion, and even retain an elevated status within a changing society? So, turning now to the origins of Clan O'Donnelly and their blood ties with the O'Neills. It's generally believed that Clan O'Donnelly are descended from Donnell, King of Ailech, with the first being Donnell living around 1040 AD. Now, they were part of the Kinaloan, originating probably in Drumlane, north of Lifford in County Donegal, and known as the Fairdrumma. They abandoned Drumlane to the Kinalconnell and moved to southeast Tyrone, probably in the mid-11th to mid-12th century. They were supporters of the O'Neills in the Kinaloan power struggle with the McLaughlins. Around AD 1167, there was a truce. Territory south of Slieve Gallion was assigned to O'Neill. Now, O'Neill required a Luchie to support him. Household families established on their estates at this time included the O'Donnellys at Ballydonnelly, directly related to the O'Devlins and hence their presence in the genealogy of Drummullen, ancestor of the O'Devlins. However, 2 Donnellys in the succession, as you see on the table on the, whoops, it's jumped. There's 2 in blue here. The name appears twice, roughly around 1130 and 1040, so it's going from oldest up to most recent in those terms. That's actually from Father Devlin's article in Shanaka Surwaha in 1971. So, the line of O'Donnelly. This slide shows an extract from O'Donovan's Annals of Ireland, Volume 3, published in 1848. Unfortunately, the pedigree of Clan O'Donnelly finishes with the death of MacGillan O'Donnelly, chief of the Fair Drama of Drumleen in 1177. There's no further information until the 1500s and the ancestors of the O'Donnellys of Ballydonnelly. So sadly, despite we having a number of, if you like, ancient Irish sources and other things, there's a big gap there from the death of Gillan O'Donnelly by John de Courcy. He was killed by him in 1177 until we get right up to the 1500s. There's this gap of about 300 to 400 years, and no one seems to have found anything really to close that gap. So this is the Grinnan of Ailech. Any of you have ever been able to visit the site, and this of course would have been sort of, if you like, the spiritual centre of the King of Ailech, and it's in Donegal. And I've just done that wee map there to show that's it up. Involved in this 700 to 800 year odd period, but it's nice to be able to sort of place it all on a map and get an idea where we're talking about in geographical terms. So the role in the next few slides, I want to try and place the O'Donnellys within the ONeillship or the Luchie, and I would like to thank Dr. Colm Donnelly of Queen's University for his kindness in letting me refer to his work from 2011. Colm Donnelly led a team from Queen's on roughly about 6 weeks, I think it was in total maybe, in the area in Castlecaulfield, doing a dig on the grounds of the castle itself. And I was fortunate enough to accompany Colm briefly one afternoon to the Donnelly Crannog, and it was, albeit a brief period, but it was amazing what we discovered in literally 20 minutes. So this map here, or series of maps, we can see from the Bartlett campaign maps, which is the left-hand side, which date from around 1602-3, how he details the location of the O'Neill households, families such as the McCalls, in the middle section of map, the O'Hagans, they're just, you can see them in the larger map in the top right hand corner, and then the O'Devlins, they're in there as well. So really what Bartlett's doing here, he's actually identifying on the map this household support group for O'Neill. That's how much importance the Crown Army strategists were giving to recording this information. If you're going to take anybody on in battle, you need to know how your enemy ticks. You need to know the structures, who's who, who's responsible for what. And it actually got as far as being placed on the maps of the time that Bartlett undertook. And what's interesting is when you take that information from those maps in the early 1600s and you place it today, you can clearly see how these household family lands literally in Dungannon on the sort of western, eastern and northern sides. Now either's not particularly anything on the southern side, I don't know, but it kind of states to me how much the O'Neills regarded the O'Donnells. It was Donegal, and they were the ones that you were likely to expect an attack from, I think. But the family lands is the O'Donnellys, McCalls, the Quinns, the Devlins and the O'Hagans. It forms a circle around the north of Donegal, or Dungannon there. Now, this slide contains extracted transcripts from the Book of Clandyboy. So, Co.Donegal, contained in the 17th century compilation Book of Clandyboy, written down in the late 16th century, but an oral transmission since probably the 14th century. It was translated by Father Eamon Devlin in Seanachas Artwaha in 1970. So it sets out the rights and entitlements of the O'Neills with regards to the other major lordships in Ulster. For example, the Maguires and the O'Donnells. It's aspirational. Also, however, provides genuine insight into the organisation of society within the O'Neill Lordship and the roles played by the household families within the Lordship. It says here, O'Donnelly's mentioned twice in the text. In the first instance, the O'Donnelly, as O'Neill's Marshal, served O'Donnell when he came to O'Neill's country on martial matters. So what's interesting is the time period this dates from must have been a relative quiet, in that there was obviously some degree of dealings between these two great ancient houses, the O'Donnells and the O'Neills. And the O'Donnellys would play, from, if you like, from a military point of view, they would play this kind of meet and greet role if the senior O'Donnell chieftain came down to Dungannon. Should O'Donnell come to O'Neill's place on a visit, it is Mulgrew who provides his food and drink, and Mulgrew gets the heads and the hinds. Should O'Donnell be waiting for military supplies or maintenance, O'Donnelly is his marshal, and if it is he who slaughters the beeves, cattle, it is his people get the giblets. So there's a very strong identification between the quality of food available on the basis of hierarchy and rank, very, very clearly laid out there. The second reference to the O'Donnellys relates to the position and rights of the O'Donnellys as one of the O'Neill's household family. O'Donnellys are O'Neill's Marshal. They get one share out of because it's obviously going to apply to things like food, but it'll apply to goods as well, and perhaps, for want of a better word, booty on the basis of a campaign. So a penny out of each man's share for a raid or the making of an encampment. One of them takes charge in a parade. So if there's any kind of celebratory act, the Donnellys have a marked out role of significance. They get the heads and hides on the first night they move from one tooth or district to another. But if there is the type of billeting called Congal on the territory around, Mulgrew ought to get the heads and the hides. So quite interesting there to sort of get a little bit of an insight into this grouping of families and where some of those roles lie. And we can quite clearly see that the O'Donnellys have a very senior role within that household. Oops, what has happened here? Okay. Bear with me. I think I've skipped a page here. Just bear with me, it has, it's jumped on. Sorry. Now, we have an English account of the O'Neill lands from 1567. So we're getting an outsider's eye view, if you like, of these relationships and who's where. So it says, this Ballydonnelly in the land of the MacDonalds, who are a sept of Galaglas, and MacDonald is always chief captain of the same. He hath underneath him in his country called Ballygall these many names of countries following: Ballyroo, Clonanese, Coshoon, Clanurty, which Clanurty reacheth within 4 miles of the castle of Dungannon. O'Dullins, or O'Devlin as we would know it today, land. This O'Dullin's land is that which Shane calleth his Luchgee, which in English is household. And within that O'Dullin's land are diverse names as followeth, viz. Mointer-Evelyn, Clanachry, in which Clanachry some of the Donnells do dwell, Ballycohen, which is a sept of people called the O'Coins, the Quins. Tallaogue is a sept of people called the O'Hagans. Ballyo'Donnell, the Ballybreeze, O'Corrigan, Mointer-Amel, in these 4 parcels do dwell the sept of the Donnells, which are all Shane's fosterers. What's interesting there is we see the role of fostership clearly recorded by this English commentator in 1567. So sadly, it's not known when Clan O'Donnelly settled, specifically at Ballydonnelly, but we can surmise it was sometime after 1177. That would have been a move from Drumleen in Donegal. So, in this slide, the first mention of Ballydonnelly is in the Annals of the Four Masters for the year 1531, when it is recorded that Ballydonnelly was assaulted by Néill Eoghain, son of Art, son of Con O'Neill. He demolished the castle, and he made a prisoner of the son of ONeill, who was foster son of O'Donnelly, and carried him off, together with the horses and the other spoils of the town. O'Donovan tells us that the infant prisoner was none other than Shane O'Neill, who was then in fosterage with the O'Donnellys. Now, he would have been 1, 2 years old, whatever. The extract shown here is from a map circa 1590, currently held in the Maritime Museum in London, and clearly shows the Crannog Fortress, the map on the left here, at Ballydonnelly. It's accompanied by a more traditional hill fort to the west of it. It's referred to over 100 years later by Friar Mellon when he mentions about its capture by George Monro in 1643. So we have, 2 references to this island fortress in significant times in history, 1531 and 1643. There's nothing has appeared from an earlier time, but it's almost certain that it's been there for much longer than 1531. So this is, if you like, a wider snapshot of that same 1590 map. And up at the top of a red circle round, you'll see it. You can see the what do you call it, hill fort and the Crannog beside it, and it says over the top on the map O'Donnelly. So it's clearly identifying that particular feature on the map as O'Donnelly's land, or Ballydonnelly. We have now, the map is not oriented in the modern sense north, south, east, west. So if you can sort of tilt your head over, north that way, south this way, west and east down. So what's wonderful about this map is this depiction of, if you like, the anointing of an O'Neill at Tullyhogue, just below where the O'Donnelly feature is recorded, which was placed on this map. It dates from about 1590, thereabouts. So, wee bit later on, this would be 1609, and Josiah Bogley's mapping of Ulster for the plantation that would follow the following year. And we're looking here at the segment of the Bodley maps that covers the area of Ballydonnelly and the townlands and Ballyboes that made up the lands of the Donnellys. Now, these were Bally is known as Donnell Outra and Donnell Etra, sort of an upper and lower Ballydonnelly, if you like. The Crannog Fortress and adjoining hill fort were centred around the townland of Achlosk, as it is on this map, or Auchlish, as it is known today, adjacent to the village of Castlecaulfield. So just where the red oval is Achlosk. Now, right up to practically today, this was taken back about 2011. Remarkably, the Crannog Island still survives. And as I said, I was very fortunate to go with Colm Donnelly onto the island. That particular summer, they were working in the castle. It was very dry around that time. The Crannog is not really safely approached. It's extremely boggy from the south side. And the water that survives of the water around the original Crannog is very deep. It could be as much as 20 feet in places. It's not really a place I would recommend going without a lot of guidance and common sense as well. But it's easier approached when it's dry from the south. And within 20 minutes of being on the Crannog, we had found late medieval pottery and animal bones. 20 minutes. Now, the site is under the protection of historic monuments, and I cannot emphasise that enough. All of the local farmers that neighbour that place keep a regular eye on it, because it really would be nothing short of a disaster if anybody did manage to get onto it and loot the place, because heaven knows what would be there. I'm sure all of you remember the crannog that was discovered under what would be a new road outside Enniskillen a few years back. Has turned out to be one of the greatest Celtic Age finds in history. That wasn't a known Maguire hotspot before it was discovered. We know this is a Ballydonnelly O'Donnelly hotspot, so we've no idea what lies there. It'll not be investigated until it has to be investigated. That's the nature of archaeology today. You don't just do things because you can. You've got to have a good reason. Perhaps if it was under threat from the environment in some way or whatever, that would possibly spark it. But it's safe where it is. It's been there for centuries. It's not going to go away. But need to keep an eye on it, for want of a better word. So, as stated by several historians, evidence suggests that at some point between 1177, Clan O'Donnelly became the hereditary marshals of the O'Neill forces and fosterers of the children of the O'Neill. The peak of this relationship would seem to have occurred in the 16th century. Before I investigate the line of Clan O'Donnelly from the 16th century, I think it's important to establish the wider relationships that existed between various Gaelic families at this time. This slide is an attempt to visualise the relationships between the primary Gaelic families of Ulster from around 1530 to 1596. It is a picture of dizzying complexity and explains the difficulties in maintaining peace and stability when set against the external influences of England, firstly under Henry VIII, then Edward VI, Mary I, and finally Elizabeth I. This was a period when the ancient cultural traditions and structures of Gaeldom collided with the newly developing politics of England and continental Europe. Throw in over 1,000 years of papal influences and the Scottish Reformation of 1560, and I think even a modern political analyst would run a mile. I would defy any spin doctor to have mapped their way through that, but we'll come to one who was as close as we're ever going to find to a spin doctor in the 1500s. It should also be noted that in the midst of this confusing picture, Archibald Campbell, over in the darker blue on the far right, 4th Earl of Argyll, had become a devout Protestant from 1556 under the guidance of John Knox. Regardless of this fact, the Argylls still sought to exercise the ancient customs of alliance and rivalry with their Gaelic brothers in Ireland and vice versa. In the centre of the chart, with the heavy red outline, I would draw your attention to Terence Daniel, i.e. Turlough O'Donnelly, Dean of Armagh, and foster brother of Shane O'Neill, whom I shall talk of in more detail shortly. But just to reflect on this, it's like the map of the metro or the underground in London, mapped onto the 16th century Gaelic families of Ulster. So obviously on the far left here we have the MacDonalds of Donegal in the Scottish Isles who settled in County Antrim. We have the O'Neills next to them, beginning with Clonbacha all the way down to Turloughlena. We then have Edmund O'Donnelly of Ballydonnelly, again aligned with the O'Neills. We have Manus O'Donnell, King of Tyrconnell, on down to his son Calva. We have Hector MacLean of the island of Mull in the west coast of Scotland. And then, of course, the hugely powerful Campbells of Argyll. Now, all lines represent marriages. And nearly every one of these marriages are not love matches. They are marriages, power plays, land grabs, money grabs, rivalries of one kind, or just simply to keep the peace. That is the way it had to be done. And it is utterly remarkable how Shane is stuck in the middle of this mess, is what I can only describe it as. With multiple marriages crossing various houses, that kind of adds to the whole confusion of his term as O'Neill, I think. On one day, Shane would be happy to take the huge force of support from the Campbells of Argyll. And I can tell you now, I don't think Shane gave a jot at whether Archibald Campbell IV of Argyll became a Protestant in 1556. I think that mattered very little to Shane. What he wanted was 20,000 troops. But at the same time, Archibald Campbell was quite happy to play the English off against Shane because it suited him to do so. And in the middle of it, you've got poor Calva O'Donnell is basically bounced around like a rag doll in the middle of the whole thing. It was a horrendous period in history just generally. But it's very hard to get your head around the complexities of it. And you could see how there was always going to be the larger number of people would come out the wrong end of it just because of that complexity and all the other things that are going on in history at the same time. In the records of the Genealogical Office in the National Library of Ireland in Dublin, we find a pedigree of the Donnellys of Ballydonnelly. It begins with Edmund at the top here, Marshal to Cornbacca, leading to his son Donald Groom O'Donnelly, Marshal to Shane, and then Shane O'Donnelly, Marshal to Hugh. So you can see the O'Donnellys through that whole time period maintaining that hierarchy of relationships, the fosterage role, the military role, that is being maintained. Now there is some degree of clouding by the time you get through to Hugh's term, where perhaps Galaglas in some ways might be getting their feet under the door in places they hadn't before, but it would be wrong to overplay that. Hugh was far too shrewd to really have all his eggs in one basket, whether it was a Donnelly or a MacDonald or even a MacLean, because the MacLeans would have acted as Galaglas as well. This slide takes us then to Patrick Mudder O'Donnelly of Crosscavenagh, and then Terence O'Donnelly, Sheriff of Tyrone in 1687. The last few slides have shown us how the O'Donnellys were ever present with the O'Neills in the centuries leading up to the flight of the Earls in 1607. Their hereditary role as marshals and fosterers to the O'Neills likely placed them at the top of the support structure in maintaining control of the O'Neill lands. The height of this key relationship was undoubtedly the time of Shane O'Neill, when one of the O'Donnellys would rise to a prominence thought unimaginable for the time. So, before I look at some key figures in the O'Donnelly story, if you like, from this time period on down towards the present day, I want to show the results of my latest research into the O'Donnellys of Ballydonnelly. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the collapse of Gaelic Ulster in the early 1600s, that the fortunes of the O'Donnellys would collapse with it. I mean, they were at such an elevated level. Surely, take Hugh out of the equation, what's their role? On the contrary, the O'Donnellys had a proud past in the upper echelons of Gaelic society, and they were not about to let their high status go. This chart includes Terence Daniel, Dean of Armagh, whom we will come to shortly, up the top right there. Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly, Roman Catholic Bishop of Dromore, whose brother Terence was Bishop of Derry. Vice Admiral Sir Ross Donnelly, confidant of Nelson. Arthur Donnelly of Blackwatertown, a successful merchant and part of the developing middle class of the 18th century. Margaret O'Donnelly, wife of Edward May, and matriarch of the May family dynasty, whose name still looms large in the place names of Belfast today. And finally, Captain Lachlan O'Donnelly, whose grave is still visible in the village of Néill Mór in County Tyrone. So I wanted to begin with this man here. When we examine the importance of the O'Donnellys within the Néill Mór, this is perhaps best personified in the relationship between Terence Daniel, Dean of Armagh, and Shane O'Neill in the mid-1500s. The two men were foster brothers, Shane having been, by tradition, brought up in the O'Donnelly family at their stronghold in the Cranach fortress of Ballydonnelly. The earliest reference we have for Terence Daniel is from the Carew papers and dates to the 20th of June 1549. He complains that the Earl of Tyrone, then Cornbacca, will not permit him to enjoy his deanery. The authorities of Edward VI in the palace in London instructed the Earl to comply accordingly. Very interesting. Firstly, where Terence would have the wherewithal to complain to the Crown about the Earl and think that there weren't consequences, and more importantly, that the Crown would bear any interest in what the Dean of Armagh says. So, the historian Herbert Francis Hoare of County Wexford, writing in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology on the Ulster State Papers in 1859, says this. So this is not me, this is Herbert 164 years ago. Among the most interesting of the correspondence here calendared are the letters of Terence Daniel, Dean of Armagh, which, if published, would cast curious lights on the political condition of three of the O'Neills, namely the first Earl of Tyrone, Conbaga, his notorious son Shane, and, this is a lovely phrase, the savage and timorous Sir Turlough, that's Turlough, as the Dean styles him. Those are the Dean's words, not mine. This remark, what is interesting in that remark is that he leaves that savage and timorous for Turlough. He doesn't aim it at Shane. So maybe we've been sort of targeting the wrong reckless one over the years, I don't know. This remarkable ecclesiastic's real name was Turlough O'Donnelly, for he was one of his subordinate Sept, the Ceneal Eoghain. He was thought to have been foster brother to Shane, whose strength and surety, so it was declared, lay in his foster brothers, the O'Donnellys, which at that time would draw around 300 gentlemen, probably all on horseback, which was very significant for the 16th century. In truth, now this is a very powerful statement he then makes, in truth, Dean Daniel deserves as prominent a place in Irish history during Elizabeth's time as Dean Swift fills in Anne's. So, very important that was written some 150 odd years ago by a pretty respected archaeologist and historian. So, just wanted to look at some of these sort of extracts in the slide before we go any further. So, these are just some sort of transcripts of things recorded. 1563, we find him on one of the commissioners for exercising all spiritual jurisdiction within the province of Armagh, appointed by Queen Elizabeth on December the 6th, 1563, and again in conjunction with the primate and others as commissioner for ecclesiastical causes in 1564. In 1559, the See of Armagh being vacant, Daniel held a synod of the English clergy of this diocese in St. Peter's Church at Drogheda on July the 3rd. This is a very interesting one. Sometimes the juiciest tidbits come from court letters because they're always eyeing everybody with suspicion. If you've watched The Tudors, you'll know what I mean. One wrong look, one wrong move, scaffold, you're gone. So it tends to follow through in the literature and the letters of the time. So Lord Lieutenant of the Privy Council has travailed with O'Reilly Maguire and Con O'Donnell, who remain in Her Majesty's service. This is 1562. Notwithstanding their continual great losses, has procured Turlough, the second person in Tyrone to forsake Shane. Well, that's probably more a case of Turlough recognising where the future's going and not backing the wrong horse. Sorley Boy, the new McMahon, dealings with Donal groom O'Donnell of the Sept of Terence Daniel. So there again, a firm identification that Terence is of the O'Donnellys. Dean of Armagh, to bring all his sept to serve the Queen. That is the strongest sept that followeth Shane. Again, that sort of emphasising what we've all been talking about. And a lovely one here from Richard Cray. Now, Richard Cray was the titular Archbishop of Armagh, the appointee of the Pope at this period. Had letters from the Pope to Shane O'Neill. However, so you can imagine what this conversation would have went like. So Richard has come with his letters of appointment from the Pope, right? Arrives with Shane O'Neill, and Shane turns to him and says, I desire to have the Archbishopric of Armagh for Terence Daniel. And there's really no answer to that. So the Dean there, as Cray thinks, is one of his fostered brethren. So you could sort of say everybody's trying to get a handle on what this relationship is. And it affects everybody outside Ireland, not just within Ireland but outside as well. So what I've done here is I've done a sort of a chronology, a timeline of the career of Taoiseach Daniel, split into three, really the twin influences. So on the left, the column is the crown. In the middle is just basically Terence himself. And then on the right, the papal influences. And I've sort of tried to match up the timelines where they have. So poor old Richard Cray ends up in the Tower of London by 1585. We see various appointings of the Archbishop of Armagh from, at the early days of as Dean of Armagh, Terence had George Dowdall. Then Dowdall survives through Mary the First. Adam Loftus is appointed in 1563, Thomas Lancaster in 1568 and 1584. So he survived 3 monarchs and about 4, if you like, rival bishops in Armagh, which is interesting when I read some of the other bits about Terence Daniel. The records of Terence Daniel's career pose some very interesting questions. Not least was where his faith lay. His nomination for the position of primate by William Cecil, that's the most senior civil servant, if you like, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And then Queen Elizabeth herself, in the year that she died, 1567, surely indicates that at that period he had aligned himself to the Reformist faith. Now that may only have been window dressing. I wouldn't read too much into it, which was developing under Queen Elizabeth at that time. But when Richard Cray, the Pope's appointee, communicated with Shane O'Neill in 1564, O'Neill had wanted Daniel appointed to the See of Armagh, suggesting that at that time he was still honouring his mother faith and Rome. So we've got a guy here that can literally blow any direction he needs to. Is that just a matter of self-survival? Is it purely selfish? Is it about him? Is it about something that is important to him, which is his fellow countrymen, their position, their survival within the wider European context? I think there's a lot of things going on there. So, June 1549, the Dean of Armagh explains that the Earl of Tyrone won't permit him. We mentioned this earlier. In 1553, Queen Mary gave a grant of English liberties to Terence of the Irish nation and blood and confirmed the estate he had in the Deanery of Armagh. So, survived that transition. Shane O'Neill sends letters to the Queen by him in 1559. On September 1560, he with Patrick Dean of Tullyhogue and Sir John Garvey as Shane's commissioners to negotiate with the Lord Deputy. So he's acting as a kind of an ambassador for Shane. Then in Cecil's handwriting, dated Windsor, 7th of August 1563, that the Dean of Armagh may be primate. So this is William Cecil saying, I want this to happen. That then the current primate be made Bishop of Kildare and the Dean of St. Patrick's, that the Bishop of Kildare be made the Bishop of Meath, the Cantor of Armagh, Patrick Darrell, to be Dean, so that takes Terence's old job. Here's his explanation. Would promise to do much with Shane O'Neill, and some think he could perform it. Now, William Cecil was perhaps one of the wiliest individuals that ever lived, because if he could survive that time period in history at that level, he must have had a brain on him the size of an elephant. But October the 14th, the Queen writes, similar to Sussex, but despite the Queen's opinion that Terence be made bishop or primate, and that Cecil's opinion, even at their level, you would sort of think that's going to happen, there was enough connivance in the court that Loftus was given the role instead. So, fascinating stuff. In 1564, it said he was appointed on the commission to enforce attendance at church and cause all bishops to subscribe to the royal supremacy. So he's definitely doing the court's prerogative in London. Conformancy. Definitely doing that in 1564. And then in 1565, O'Neill sent him his envoy with presents to the Queen in England. This is the shenanigans that Shane was up with. On one minute he's schmoozing Elizabeth, and the next minute he's wiping out an entire garrison in Armagh. Very much blows hot and cold, different directions. Very hard to get a handle on. And in the middle of this, we have Terence Daniel trying to make something out of it. So Richard Cray, writing to Cecil, states that when O'Neill broke down the Metropolitan Church of Armagh, his reasons were the safeguarding of his country. But not long after that, Shane, as we all know, was slain in County Antrim on the 2nd of June 1567. So I don't know if we can term Terence Daniel a power broker, but it is incredible the degree to which he likely influenced the events in Ireland for a period of 10 to 15 years, and most certainly during the tenure of Shane O'Neill. Now, Terence died in 1585, and thanks to Bishop Reeves' work in the 19th century, his will, there was a transcript taken of his will, which was made on the 10th of August 1585. We can see that he left money towards the maintenance of Armagh Cathedral, obviously a major part of his life, and the profits of his parsonage at Rathweir to be divided between his nephew Barnaby and his friend John Cusack, his nephew being sole executor. He expressed his desire to be buried in the Cathedral of Armagh, which seems more than fitting for such a distinguished and long-standing servant of that church. An interesting footnote to the will is that it was made in the house of Edward Connell, as this is how it was recorded in Bishop Reeves' transcript, in the new fort of the Blackwater. This Edward Connell was in fact Edward Cornwall, who was the commander of the Blackwater fort at that time. And he was almost certainly the likely son of John Cornwall, the first commander of the Blackwater fort. Edward seems to have married into a local Irish family, as would appear from later events in 1594, when, to avoid needless bloodshed, he surrendered the Blackwater fort to the forces of Hugh O'Neill through the intercedence of his wife and with the local Irish commander. He was charged with treason by Bagnall, but acquitted. I'm indebted to historian James O'Neill, who has talked here, the author of The 9 Years' War, an excellent book, for the extracts shown from documents held in the National Archives. So this is the deposition of Edward Cornwall on his charge of treason, and that's actually his name inside that red box. So you can see the date, February 1594. So that's the actual document. So Edward Cornwall, it was his house in the Blackwater fort that Terence Daniel's will was recorded. He would have been a witness to it then. Now, we're going down through other Donnellys, if you like. So really what I'm doing here by going down all these local characters, or whatever you want to call it, or eminent members of the family, is I'm really trying to say, right, Hugh has left in 1607 with O'Donnell. We sort of see this as a grand collapse of Gaeldom. So what happens to all the other supporting families? They're left behind, the vast majority of them. Now, obviously not everybody can propel themselves into the upper echelons of society, but it is reasonable to believe that the senior members of that O'Donnelly clan were not about to let go of that status. So what do? The Gaeldom that you have survived within for centuries is gone. You now have English rule, English laws, you have prohibitive customs, practices, laws, all of these things. So what do you do? Now, obviously, there were others that were prepared and possibly able to do so in the roles that they would take on to remain aligned to their ancient faith and tradition. So many of you will, of course, have heard of Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly and his association with the name Bard of Armagh. He's believed to be buried in this grave next to the Anglican parish church of Desert Crete. His story is for another time, but I think it worth mentioning a few points regarding him. Despite the long-standing belief he died in 1716, research by Eric Dare of NUI Maynooth in 2013 records that he was in receipt of a French pension from 1716 to 1722 and was residing in Dublin. And that's in the Archive National in Paris. The Stewart papers also record that he did not die until the year 1728. So what happened in those 12 years beyond what was traditionally regarded as his death? Even though he and possibly brother Terence are buried in Desert Crete, it's my belief they were the sons of Patrick O'Donnelly of Gordalary, listed in the Down survey as in possession of 47 acres Irish at the time. It's also my belief that around the time of Cromwell's campaign in Ireland, the O'Donnellys of Gordalary, and indeed some of those from around Ballydonnelly, were transplanted to the Midlands and counties Longford and Westmeath. I'm sure you've all heard of the phrase "to hell or Connaught," which is supposed to have been uttered by Cromwell in a way of, in only the style that Cromwell could do. And he was probably in particular targeting people like the Donnellys of Ballydonnelly. He wanted to target the senior branches of families. That's, if you were going to get an uprising, it was going to come through the leadership of those people. Not so much ordinary people, but those people. And they would have went out of their way to find them and, right, you're not hanging around here any longer, sort of thing. So, I'm sure many of you will have heard of the story of Shane Barna O'Donnelly and his exploits as a Tory or a rapparee in the area around Altmore and Pomeroy, County Tyrone. But perhaps you might not be aware that his brother Peter was also cited as a rapparee, as can be seen from this transcript of a Dublin proclamation of 1715. So you can see in the red lettering the extract said, Peter Donnelly, lately a soldier in Sir John Whitwrong's regiment and brother to Shane Barna O'Donnelly. Now, there was a fairly significant groupings of Donnellys in that Fermanagh Tyrone border area. And the older graveyards around there, you will see those names appear in those graveyards, and O'Neills as well. And that seemed to be a centre of rebellion, if you like, that was away from Ballydonnelly. I mean, not all the Donnellys lived in Ballydonnelly, of course. There were other parts of Tyrone they were in. But it's interesting to note that a lot of this rapparee activity seemed to have a focus on the Tyrone-Fermanagh border, and this kind of emphasises it in this proclamation. We come now to perhaps the most important O'Donnelly in terms of historical significance, after Terence Daniel. And could you have guessed it, in the modern era of gender equality and beyond, it's a woman at the head of this story. It's not a man, it's a woman. But she is the heir of a senior line of the O'Donnellys, Margaret. She's the daughter of Art O'Donnelly of Ballydonnelly, and none of his sons must have survived. The evidence for Margaret comes in the form of a remarkable document that survives among the records in the Genealogical Office in Dublin. It's a funeral certificate for Edward May of Dublin, who died on the 8th of March 1640. The certificate records his wife Margaret and that of their 7 surviving children of the time. The document is of great significance because it connects a daughter of the senior line of O'Donnelly with a post-plantation Englishman. So who was Edward May? And why might the marriage to Margaret have taken place? So the first thing you say to yourself, it's a love match. Plain and simple, nothing more than that. The fact that they come from 2 diverse cultures and ancient histories is irrelevant. We know that there's famous romances down through the millennia of people that crossed cultural lines and romance blossomed on us. We can't say it wasn't. What is more likely is there was something in it for both parties. In this slide, we find John Lodge's transcription of an indenture involving Phelemy O'Donnell of Mountjoy, selling the title to the townland of Crosscavanagh to one Edward Mays on the 17th of December 1638. It's fairly certain that this Edward Mays and the Edward May of Dublin mentioned previously are one and the same person, as the name appears as Edward May in other land acquisitions of the period around Ballydonnelly and elsewhere. Who was Edward May? Well, he was the son of Sir Thomas May of Mayfield in Sussex, as given in the early funeral certificate. Unfortunately, no images of him have so far been found, but the image shown here is that of his brother Thomas, who was a poet. However, how we find Edward in Ireland is perhaps found in the story of his second cousin, a key figure in the life and politics of the English court in the early 17th century. Now, if Turla O'Donnelly, Terence Daniel, was a powerful figure within Irish politics, if you like, of the time in the 16th century, This guy was a huge player in the early 1600s. So this is Sir Humphrey May, 1574 to 1630. He's second cousin of the Edward May that married Margaret O'Donnelly. Okay, so fairly close. Born in London, son of Richard May, a merchant tailor. But here's the important bit. From 1600 to 1603, he was a gentleman usher to none other than Charles Blount, 8th Baron Mountjoy. So he was literally in the centre of the conflict, bringing an end to the 9 Years' War. Who would Sir Humphrey have not met, known, found out about? He would literally have his finger on the pulse of how Ulster in particular ticked over that 3-year period. Was he a player in getting Edward involved? And why, when Edward was living in Dublin, did he come all the way north to marry Margaret O'Donnelly? So, it's my belief that the connections were established before the flight of the Earls in 1607 between the O'Donnellys and the Mays, and indeed the Caulfields. It is well recorded that Sir Toby Caulfield took responsibility for Con O'Neill, who'd been left behind in 1607. Could Con have remained with the O'Donnellys in 1607? And did they set him under the protection of Sir Toby? Sir Toby would have been in a far more powerful place at that time to protect Con for whatever his reasons were. We know that he placed him at Eton School and paid for his lodgings and education. In the years from 1607 to 1610, Sir Toby Caulfield gained a remarkable insight into the workings of the old ONeillship centred around Dungannon. How did he gain that knowledge? Were the O'Donnellys involved? Could Sir Humphrey have played some role in this relationship also? Of course, evidence is required, but I don't think it unreasonable to surmise the possibility of a relationship between these parties. The senior line of the O'Donnellys might obtain some degree of protection and status with such powerful connections, and their ancient knowledge of Ballydonnelly and literally how the ONeillship ticked could be of huge benefit to the Caulfields and the Mays. Just before I leave this slide, this is a comment made about Sir Humphrey by John Cusack in 1615 in a letter, I think it is, to Ralph Winwood. Sir Humphrey May can make any suitor, be they never so honest, disliked by the king. So what he's trying to say is that Humphrey's power was so powerful during the reign of James I that if he took a dislike to you, he only had to whisper something in the king's ear and you were history. That's how powerful. He was a member of what was known as the Star Chamber. That was where all the decisions were taken. So anybody in that Star Chamber was literally at the centre of political life in England at the time. Here we can see the extent to which the line of Margaret O'Donnelly, matriarch of the May family in Ireland, stands within the history of Ireland. Now, you might say, right, it's a talk, we're talking about the O'Donnellys. They had this elevated and important position with the Néill Mór. But really what I'm trying to do, we only have information for that quite extensive period of time. It's quite limited. What I'm really trying to say to you here is they enjoyed that elevated status for so long. That was not going to be an easy thing to put to one side if you were a part of that upper level of the family. So they did what they did during the Gaelic times. They forged alliances. They met the right people. They did deals. I suspect this is what really went on. So, firstly, within just 2 generations, this is probably one of the most amazing facts. So we have Margaret. None of these people would have lived without Margaret. She is the matriarch of this entire familial line. Her grandson, Humphrey, is made Chief Secretary for Ireland in 1699. He is the second most powerful human being on the island. The only people above him is the Lord Chief Justices and the King. Or, yes, it had been King William at the time. That's not bad going in 3 generations. Whilst the name has gone, a blood descendant of the O'Donnellys was at the centre of power in Ireland, and these remarkable connections would not stop there. The family would set up its seat in County Waterford at Gracedew, later called Mayfield, in the early 1700s, before moving to Belfast in the late 1700s. A string of parliamentary seats followed, culminating with the influence of Sir James Edward May, MP for Belfast in the early 1800s. The May family left their mark on Belfast, not only in how it developed, but on its very place names: May Street, Edward Street, May's Market. But perhaps as one of the most incredible twists of fate we find in Irish history is that Anna, Margaret Donnelly's 4 times great-granddaughter, would marry George Augustus Chichester, 2nd Marquess of Donegal. Now, you'll know what the name Chichester is. One of the most notorious characters of the 9 Years' War period and after. In fact, the marriage was part of an arrangement whereby Anna's father, Sir James Edward May, would cover the substantial debts of the Marquess and his release from the debtor's prison in London in 1795. In time, however, it was discovered that Anna was an illegitimate daughter of Sir Edward, and it required legislation passed in 1822 by the Parliament in London to legitimise all of those heirs afterwards in the Marquessate of Donegal, which ended. Now, Margaret's line of descent as a matriarch on the Chichester-Donegal family lasted until 1975, with the death of the 6th Marquess. And then the Marquessate passed to another line of the Chichesters. But her line, that she would have begun through that marriage of her 4 times great-granddaughter, ended in 1975. As I often say, you could not make this up. In 2020, I was delighted to make contact with a living descendant of Margaret O'Donnelly, and in time I would hope to add to the existing research on this remarkable family. So I just wanted to show just a few extracts from the family, sort of where they lived. This is Rocket's Castle, down in County Waterford. This is May Park, which is now an elderly care home outside Waterford, and Waterford General Hospital is just to the south of it, here. In 1666, Sir Algernon May, 3rd cousin of Edward, and his wife Dorothy Reynolds, this is another one of these bizarre twists, received extensive grants of land. So Algernon is 3rd cousin of Edward May of Dublin, Margaret's line. He gets these extensive grants, Rocket's Castle, Gracedew, in 1666. These lands were passed to Edward, grandson of Margaret O'Donnelly, in the early 1700s. It is interesting to note, and you couldn't make this up either, that Dorothy Reynolds, who Sir Algernon was married to, was the sister of Sir John Reynolds, who married Sarah Russell. Sarah Russell was sister-in-law of none other than Henry Cromwell, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So you couldn't make this stuff up. So, there's May's Market, the 1920s. If you're sharp-eyed enough from this distance, away in the background across the road is St George's Market, which of course was restored, is still there. But that's May's Market as it was then. This was all reclaimed land. Caused a lot of disruption, and he wasn't a popular man for doing it. But it's all there today. It has survived it. And that is Anna Chichester, née May, 2nd Marchioness of Donegal, who lived from 1774 until 1849. And she was the 5 times great-granddaughter of Art O'Donnelly of Ballydonnelly. And her portrait hangs in the Belfast Harbour Commissioner's offices today. Now, you might never have seen this picture before. This is Admiral Sir Donnelly. This is an engraving. There's only one that I know of exists in the Maritime Museum at Greenwich in London. And luckily I managed to get this copy from them. So he'd previously been thought to come from around Benburb, but we now know that he was likely born in Athlone, son of Dr. Francis Donnelly. However, his family roots are of course much nearer, as we shall see. The engraving was done in 1837 and is part of the collections at the Royal Maritime Museum at Greenwich in London. The artist William Salter obtained the patronage of the Duke of Sussex, who was said to have been a friend of the Admiral's. Duke of Sussex, by the way, was the youngest son of King George III. Not a bad friend to have. So, the Admiral received his warrant of arms in 1837. And in addition to the recognisable elements of the arms of O'Donnelly, which is the bowed arm with the skein or dagger, there are a number of additions. The crown symbol includes the date 1st of June 1794 because Ross took part in the significant battle at that date against the French Revolutionary fleet. But perhaps the most, and this is where it gets interesting, this would seem to be a perfectly typical figure of late 18th century, early to mid Victorian English society. He's a rear admiral, he's a friend of the youngest son of George III, blah, 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 blah. But yet, at the top of this coat of arms, what does it say? Justitia tandem. Latin for justice at last. So what is he referring to? I think it's my personal belief that Donnelly viewed the warrant as an acknowledgement not only of his undoubted skill as a naval officer, he uses various motifs, you can see the seals on the crown and things like that, but also that of his ancient and noble Irish heritage had some recognition through him, albeit in a very unrelated way. It's under an English crown. He's serving in what ostensibly is an English Royal Navy. But again, you've got to understand, if you like, the pedigree, the level of status that he originates from, that this desire to never let go of that, for want of a better word. Now, there's a text that goes with this. And what it says here, Sir Ross Donnelly, Knight Commander of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, setting forth that he is descended from the ancient Sept family of O'Donnelly, formerly of Co.Tyrone, in the county of Tyrone, a branch of the ancient royal house or Sept of ONeill, kings of Ulster, monarchs of Ireland, and served his late Majesty King George. Co.Tyrone is Co.Donegal, with a mixture of Irish, being anglicised, all these sorts of things that occurred throughout the 200 or 300 years, last 200 or 300 years. This wonderful website, place names, Kate Kenyur's team. You can see the Co.Tyrone, Co.Tyrone, 1630, and then you follow that down. Co.Donegal is first used around about 1778, and that's the Co.Donegal that's there, basically the southern half of Cookstown today. And if we take that right back to 1657, look who is in Gort Aloran, Patrick O'Donnelly. Now that, I believe, is the father of Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly, Bard of Armagh as well. Okay. As I said, it had been thought that Ross came from this part of the world, but this is the evidence that kind of turned things in another direction. So on the left we have Sir William Betham's will abstract for Ross's grandfather, Francis Donnelly, apothecary of Athlone, who died in around 1717. And his children he records as Francis, Patrick, Thomas and Letitia. And then to the right we have William Betham's will transcript for Ross's father. And you can clearly see in the red outline Ross as third son identified there as a recipient of his father's will. And really, to cap it all off, this is an extract from Saunders' newsletter from 1810, recording the death of Ross's mother at the age of 85. And it clearly states, and mother of Captain Donnelly. At that time, Ross was a captain. He wasn't an admiral until very late on in his life. Now, we have that picture of Ross. This is Ross's daughter, Anne Jane, who married Baron Audley. And that possibly was taken around the time of her marriage. I'm not 100% sure. But this was a bitter pill to swallow. On the left is Ross Donnelly's trunk as captain, probably on the Pegasus. It was sold at auction in southern England back, I think it was 2017, for £280. I was able, by hook and by crook, to get speaking to the guy that had owned it when it was sold, before he sold it. And it was his father that owned it. His father was, guess what, ex-Royal Navy from Plymouth. So that's why he had bought it, you know, that connection to he probably knew who Ross was. He probably knew the whole history. But that to me is like a national treasure. And it's somewhere in England, because of obviously GDPR and all this sort of thing. You can't ring up the auction house and find out who owns it and then go and cajole and browbeat them until they say, you shouldn't own that, that should be over here, in Athlone at least. And then the other item to the right, well, there was never a chance I could have bought that anyway, but that's a snuff box that was owned by Admiral Sir Ross Donnelly, probably a gift, maybe even from the Duke of Sussex. And it was sold in 2017 for £6,500. I think it's 22 carat gold. Now this is a remarkable aspect of Ross's life. Ross was godfather to this lovely girl here, who is Ellen Mangles. She had lost her father quite young. He had been a comrade of Ross's in the Royal Navy, and he stood for her when she married this man, James Stirling, who became the governor of Western Australia in the 1830s. And guess what James Stirling did? So now, he is merely the husband of the goddaughter of Ross Donnelly. But what did he do? He named a river in Western Australia after him. That's on pretty good authority with the Australian authorities themselves, that the Donnelly River in Western Australia near Perth was named after Admiral Ross Donnelly. But sadly, it came to a kind of, well, just a very sad end, melancholy end. He was subjected to the cruelty of dementia in late life, in his last years. And worse than that, he was the subject of the harsh lunacy laws at the time, which basically robbed any particular individual from practically everything. At his death, he was buried in the family plot of his son-in-law's family, the Bromelows in Kensal Green, London, and that's the grave. So he doesn't even have his own dedicated gravesite. Probably the usual falling outs of the children under him and that sort of thing. Now, the last Donnelly I wanted to just look at is Hugh Donnelly of Drodult. And these are all people with a core connection to the primary Donnellys. And this takes us into this territory. So he's Hugh Donnelly of Drodult, and he's the son of Terence O'Donnelly, who would have been Sheriff of Tyrone in 1687 under James II. He must have spent some time in the west of Ireland as a young man, and it was surely there that he met his future wife, Charlotte Alice de Butts. Yes, you heard me right, de Butts. She was the daughter of Lawrence de Butts of Oakfield, a Huguenot distiller and burgess of the town of Sligo in the late 1600s. Hugh's father was, as I said, Sheriff of Tyrone. It would seem then moved to Tyrone after he and Alice were married, and their son Arthur was born probably in Drodult in 1722. Now this fascinating deed memorial refers to Drodult. Sorry, that's just the line of succession. We just have it outlined in R. And Arthur Donnelly is mentioned in that. And this is the Arthur Donnelly of Blackwater Town. Arthur married Margaret Mahan of Roscommon in 1769, and their son John married Rebecca Young, daughter of Reverend John Young of Eden in 1793. By the late 1700s, Arthur Donnelly was a merchant of considerable standing, a trusted confidant of his fellow merchants and landed gentry of County Armagh. Along with warehousing in Newry, he was able to transport goods from his base in Blackwater Town to Newry, and then wherever you like in the globe. And the family would come to connect itself to the East India Company, which would certainly be very lucrative. His son John, this is an extract from a lease involving John, and he inherited his father's business in 1785. The lease dates from 1816 and clearly shows a seal showing the crest of O'Donnelly being the embowed arm with the skein or dagger in it, and then his initials, JD, for John Donnelly. Now, John and his wife Rebecca had a son Arthur who married Sophia Hogan, daughter of Michael Hogan. Guess where they married? Valparaiso, Chile, in 1823. Hogan was a former officer of the Royal Navy who had become part of the new American administration at the beginning of the 19th century. It would appear that young Arthur was being prepared to expand the Donnelly business into America. And the marriage to Sophia would potentially open many doors and opportunities, not least of which was the Hogan land on Manhattan Island, which, if fate had dealt a better hand, might well have made them one of the richest families in America if it had developed. However, wasn't to be. What might have been a long and fruitful mercantile and indeed family life was cut cruelly short with the death of young Arthur in 1836. Arthur and his family were sailing to New York where they hoped to begin a new stage in their lives. A storm grounded the ship, the Bristol, off Rockaway Beach in Manhattan. But Arthur's bravery in helping to save the lives of his family and many others was outstanding. But before a skiff could return to save him, the vessel broke up and he was drowned, aged 38. He's remembered in a fitting memorial in Trinity Church graveyard in the middle of Manhattan Island. That's the memorial. Now, another son, Captain Thomas Donnelly, he applies for a grant of arms. And the writing that goes with his is quite interesting. He refers in his grant, because you basically give the Ulster King of Arms what you want said about you, and provided it's not outlandish and ridiculous, he will put it down. So what he says is the senior branch of the old Milesian family of O'Donnelly, formerly of Ballydonnelly, County Tyrone. So regardless of where these men were at the middle of a developing landed gentry society in Ireland at their time or whatever, they are constantly referring back to their ancient Irish heritage. They never lose sight of that. Another son, William Donnelly, 1805 to 1879. Guess what he is? He's the first ever Registrar General in Ireland, responsible for the censuses of Ireland from 1851 to 1871, responsible for the first register of marriages for Protestants in 1845, and then the register of everything else in 1864. Yeah, that's all the workings of William Donnelly, son of the Donnellys of Blackwatertown. In the archives of the Royal Irish Academy, there's lovely hints at correspondence between William and you remember I referred to O'Donovan's Annals of Ireland, published in 1848. I don't know how many volumes there were. While O'Donovan was putting that together, he was having conversations or correspondence with none other than William Donnelly. And the lovely wee piece in the middle of it, he says, I would like a print of the sheet Anno 1531 in particular. Now, if you remember what I told you earlier, that's when the island was attacked by Art, son of Con, and Shane was taken away as an infant. So he wanted to see what he was writing about that. So again, taking a very identifiable interest in their ancient heritage. Another of that same family, Major General Sir John Fresheville Dykes Donnelly. He is a hero of the Crimean War, an engineer, a soldier. After leaving the army, he's recruited to develop science within the Victorian education system, culminating in the development of the Kensington Museum. Do you know what the Kensington Museum became? The Victoria and Albert Museum grew out of the Kensington Museum. So he was one of the forerunners in its development. By the time of his death in 1902, he had been connected with the Science and Art Department for nearly 40 years. In finishing, I would summarise by saying that whilst the subject of my talk tonight was the importance of the O'Donnellys within the Néill Mór, we must expand our knowledge beyond the centuries leading up to 1607. For a significant number within Clan O'Donnelly, the apparent end to Gaelic Ireland was not going to be an end to their desire to remain within an elevated status. For many in the senior lines of the family, adaptation was the key. The primary mechanism of that adaptation was education and commerce. Even in the case of Admiral Donnelly, his grandfather Francis had obviously developed a successful business as an apothecary in Athlone, but we must not forget how he ended up in Athlone. He was obviously forcibly moved from Tyrone to the Midlands during the Cromwell period. The money from which he could educate and propel his descendants into the developing middle class of the 18th and 19th century. Arthur of Blackwatertown may, had his grandson survived in 1836, been the forefather of a huge American mercantile empire such as the Mellons, the Gettys, or the Rockefellers. We must also not forget possibly the most significant character in the story of Clan O'Donnelly, that of Terence Daniel, Perhaps it is now time to act on the remarks of Herbert Francis Hoare in 1859 and recognise him for his remarkable contribution to our history. And what I would say is the incredible story of the O'Donnellys has many miles to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Here, I like you.
No, you're okay. Thank you, Jonathan. History is a very interesting thing, isn't it? Starting in Blackwatertown and Dungannon and Benburb, a lot of Donnellys around Benburb from the time of Shane ONeill, of course. And I don't know whether anybody, I'm sure some of you have been to the old English graveyard on the Armagh of the Blackwatertown, full of Donnellys.
Yep. James is the most famous.
Yeah.
His grave just about survived.
So anyway, the first thing I want to ask before we continue, have we any, I'm sure we have some questions. Anybody any questions? Anybody want to ask any questions? Someone down there, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there would have been a fair number. What again? You get a very mixed picture with the '98 rebellion. Places like Auchnacloy were an absolute hotbed of the rebellion, whereas in and around Castlecaulfield things were relatively quiet. Some of it mattered as to who the commanders were in the local area with the militias, or simply if there was enough interest in it. You had, you're going ahead. Yes.
He captured the town and burned it, which didn't do it any harm, I suppose.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I actually dispute that. That was actually recorded by English chroniclers. Patrick Moder O'Donnelly always denied any involvement in it, and I, be honest with you, I believe him.
where was he displaced then after that?
Well, this is the thing. Patrick Moder O'Donnelly wasn't displaced at all. 1 year after he gave his testament to the Crown officials investigating the rebellion, he was carrying out a survey on land in and around Stewartstown with one of the Stewarts of Stewartstown. He was acting as a civil servant for the Crown. In his testimony, which is 3 to 4 pages long, if you get a chance, you can see it online and read it. It's one of the best testimonies you will ever read. He was obviously a highly educated individual, and he basically tears strips out of Randall MacDonald, who he firmly claims did the dirty work. And there's every reason to believe Randall would have done it. He had form, as they talk about in the police dramas and things. But no, I would say the evidence would suggest Patrick Moder O'Donnelly walked a very fine line. If he had thought that the rebellion had mileage, he would have supported it. But I think at a very early stage, he thought that it hadn't a chance. And as I said to you before, he wasn't about to become a victim of it, and he didn't. There were many people hanged as a result of the rebellion and out of those depositions. He was not one of them, definitely not. But as I say, if you had a chance, read his deposition. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Okay, I think.
Yeah.
Anybody else with a question? Yeah.
What was the reason for the fostering?
The fostering. Well, to be honest, James probably knows more about that than I do.
No,
I'm certainly not an expert on ancient Irish culture and traditions, but there probably was a common sense reason, James, as much as any. Yeah.
It was a social idea, social system that the Gaelic Irish, the aristocratic Gaelic Irish, carried out. They fostered their male children to some big families, not necessarily the families within the Kinlow.
Mm-hmm.
They would have fostered them to, say, the McMahons or the Maguires. Or it was building up a relationship. Like, for example, O'Neill was fostered to the O'Reillys.
Mm-hmm.
So it built up a relation between the Gaelic families. Now, as it so happened, Shane ONeill was fostered to the O'Donnellys and was very close to them afterwards. But there would have been, I think, Kieran Brady has made the point that wouldn't have been a high-class fostership to the O'Donnellys. You know, I mean, Shane wasn't in line at that stage to be the O'Neill. He was certainly not. It was only what happened in after Clonbacha accepted the earldom of Tyrone, and Matthew or Fardorcha became his heir under English law. That Shane actually rose through the ranks, and there was a civil war in Tyrone, and the O'Donnellys supported. The other thing about the O'Donnellys is, or the thing that after Shane's death, there was a big dispute. The main line of the O'Neills at that time would have been the MacShanes, basically the sons of Shane. And Q O'Neill's line was directly opposed to that. They were both sons of Clonbacha, or grandson of Clonbacha, as I suppose was Q. But the point that I'm making is that that feud that existed between the O'Neill line in Dungannon and the MacShanes continued well into the several centuries afterwards. Yeah, up at the back.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe not just as severe as that, but yeah, it was bad. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I don't think that, although Clonbacha formally recognised the writ of the king or queen of the
Henry.
I think that was more sort of a marriage of convenience, because
Absolutely.
after his time, the Gaelic system, which was not one of primogeniture, where
Yes.
all the problems that Henry VIII had,
Yeah.
of producing a son
Yes.
following, that wasn't in the Irish system at all.
No.
Whoever you could, it was more like the sort of the parliamentary system, if you like.
Yeah.
The more support you could gain within the family, then that increased your chances
Yeah.
of becoming the O'Neill. And there were the O'Neills of the Feuds, there were the Clandyboy O'Neills, there was the O'Neills of Dungannon, there was Turloughnionach in Strabane. So you had all these different people all in the mix
Yeah.
to become the O'Neill.
Yeah.
And whoever could raise the most support.
Yeah.
And one of the things you mentioned there, the MacDonalds
Yes.
in Galway.
Yeah.
Néill Mór, who was Red Hugh O'Donnell's mother, she took with her 2,000 gallow glasses. And in Gaelic society, the woman, she was married, fair enough.
Yeah.
Once she was put to the one side, then she took everything with her again. So that's why you find these powerful women who have got a say in the affairs of the clan, because they have got muscle.
Yeah. Well, then
That's a complicated study in its own there. You know, the Inyan Do and Donegal and Catherine MacLean in the time of Shane. But that's a big subject, so we don't want to go into that tonight anyway. Thank you.
Thank
you.
One more thing about is they talk about Ballydonnelly,
Yes.
and you talked about the Rapparees then on the Fermanagh border.
Yes.
I know that there's some controversy between Irish scholars
Yes.
between whether Derry Donnelly, whether not Donnelly, whether it's
Right.
name or whether it's a surname.
Right.
A whole lot of Mountjoys as well.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Because we have tea ready for anybody. Sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
What was the relationship like with the O'Donnellys and Hugh O'Neill after Shane O'Neill, was killed?
Over to you.
Yeah. It wasn't good. It wasn't good.
I don't need to be biased, James.
Q O'Neill was accused. In fact, he did hang one of Shane O'Neill's sons, Grivlach O'Donnell. He hung him outside Armagh and then went to, which under the crown system was illegal, even though he at that time he was acting for the English. In this total area, and he had to go to the Lord Deputy and make his excuses. He said this was a dangerous man. The man, of course, was the daughter of the Scotswoman, and he was coming over. He had come over from Scotland and was supposed to be bringing a large number of Redshanks over to support the McShanes. Yeah. There was always that dispute thereafter between the family, the McShane family, and the Néill Mór family in Dungannon. They stayed. Hugh got. Actually, what happened there? You see, Turlough became Néill Mór after Shane was assassinated in 1567. So the situation simply was that, as it was pointed out there with Terence O'Donnelly, some of the Donnellys went with Turlough, but they weren't as committed to Turlough and of course to Hugh as they were to Shane. There was total commitment in terms of Shane, but not with Turlough. But they did support Turlough, and the same situation would have probably existed. You can see from that talk tonight that the Donnellys, they were everywhere too, where they were all politicians, or at least at the head of the thing. Somebody has already said, has introduced politics, very similar to English politics at the minute. They went where the main chance was in the end of the day, particularly when the Gaelic system started to crumble. Thank you. Yeah,
you should always remember that when you wanted to get the English off your backs here historically, you pulled the Scots card.
I think, folks, that we'll now have a cup of tea at the back there for anybody that wants it, and a biscuit. If you want to ask any
just come and see me.
Come up and see. We want to carry on with the evening. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, James.
Oh, sorry. Before I go, one big clap for a brilliant piece of work here by Jonathan Gray, please.
Thank you.